Professor Nixara swept into the lecture hall of the Galactic Institute of Advanced Technologies, her bioluminescent tentacles creating a mesmerizing light show against the pristine white walls. The usual excited murmurs of her students died down instantly. Everyone knew that when Professor Nixara made an entrance like this, something extraordinary was about to happen. "Good morning, future masters of xenotechnology," she announced, her translator perfectly conveying her enthusiasm. "Today marks the beginning of your final project, and I promise you, it will be unlike anything attempted in this institution's 3,000-year history." Sarah Parker, the only human in the class, straightened in her seat. Being the first human accepted into GIAT had been challenging enough. The constant stares from her classmates, some with multiple eyes, had almost become normal. Almost. Around her sat the brightest young minds from across the galaxy. To her left, Blip Bloop, a gelatinous cube from the Andromeda Galaxy, vibrated with anticipation. Their friendship had started when Sarah helped them understand the concept of human jokes, though Blip Bloop still struggled with punchlines. 2 rows ahead, Xanthius, a crystalline being who communicated through light pulses, sparkled nervously. Despite being able to process information at the speed of light, they often overthought the simplest problems. "As you all know," Professor Nixara continued, her tentacles now projecting holographic images onto the walls, "our institution prides itself on pushing boundaries. We don't just study technology, we redefine it." The holoprojections showed images of ancient space stations, forgotten technological marvels, and mysterious artifacts. Sarah noticed how even the normally distracted quartz twin silicon-based life forms, who spent most classes in synchronized meditation, were now fully alert. "This semester's challenge will test not just your technical skills, but your ability to think beyond conventional methods." Professor Nixara's voice took on a more serious tone. "The Galactic Council has granted us unprecedented access to something that has puzzled xenoarchaeologists for centuries." The air in the room grew thicker with anticipation. Or maybe that was just gaseous Gary, the cloud-like student in the back row, expanding with excitement. But before I reveal more, Professor Nixara's primary eyes twinkled mischievously, while her secondary ones scanned the room. "I need to remind you all of our institution's most important rule. Never underestimate primitive technology," the class chanted in unison. Sarah couldn't help but smile. She'd learned that in this context, primitive meant anything less than 1,000 years old. Precisely, Professor Nixara's tentacles flashed in approval. Because sometimes what appears simple on the surface, she paused for dramatic effect, can change our understanding of the universe itself. Sarah felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. It was a note from Blip Bloop, their gelatinous form rippling with what she had learned to recognize as excitement. "Whatever it is, want to partner up? Your primitive human perspective might be just what we need." She grinned and nodded. In a class full of beings who could bend light, manipulate gravity, or exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, being called primitive had become something of a compliment. Besides, Blip Bloop was right. Her primitive approaches had often solved problems that stumped her technologically advanced classmates. Professor Nixara's tentacles began to glow brighter, signaling she was about to drop her bombshell announcement. Sarah leaned forward, her heart racing. Whatever this assignment was, it would either prove humans deserved a place at GIAT, or confirm what some still whispered in the halls, that accepting a human had been a mistake. Professor Nixara's tentacles swirled with excitement as she activated the central hologram projector. Above the lecture hall materialized a spinning geometric shape that Sarah had never seen before, a complex polyhedron that seemed to shift and change as it rotated. "This, my brilliant students, is the Nexus Core," Professor Nixara announced. "An artificial intelligence system so advanced that it predates the formation of the Galactic Council itself. It was discovered in the ruins of the Sigma Nebula, perfectly preserved but completely locked down." The projector zoomed in, revealing intricate patterns etched into the core's surface. Xanthius raised a crystalline appendage, their surface flickering with curiosity. "Professor, those patterns, they're unlike any programming language I've ever studied." Precisely, Nixara's tentacles flashed in approval. "The Nexus Core operates on principles that even our most advanced quantum computers can't decipher. Every attempt to access its systems has failed. Until now, we've never had a class with such diverse perspectives." Sarah felt several sets of eyes turn toward her. Being the only human suddenly felt even more significant. Your assignment, Professor Nixara continued, is to establish communication with the Nexus core. You have one standard galactic month. The team that succeeds will automatically pass this course with highest honors. More importantly, you'll have accomplished something that has eluded the greatest minds in the galaxy for centuries. Blip Bloop's gelatinous form rippled with excitement. What are the rules, Professor? Rules. Nixara's secondary eyes blinked in sequence. The only rule is this: you cannot physically damage the core. Everything else is permitted. After all, true innovation rarely follows a rulebook. The Quartz twins immediately began their synchronized planning meditation, their silicon forms humming at a frequency that made Sarah's teeth vibrate. Gaseous Gary condensed himself into his thinking form, becoming a tight, storm cloud-like mass of focused concentration. Each team will have designated time slots to attempt their methods, Professor Nixara explained. You'll work in pairs or trios. Please register your teams by the end of today. Sarah turned to Blip Bloop, who was already extending a pseudopod in friendship. Partners, they bubbled hopefully. Definitely, Sarah grinned. Though I should warn you, where I come from, hacking usually involves a lot of trial and error. Trial and error. Blip Bloop's translation came through as confused. But surely we should calculate every possibility first? That's why I brought my quantum probability matrix. They proudly produced a small device that bent light around it in impossible ways. Before Sarah could respond, Xanthias sparkled over to their desk, light patterns indicating they wanted to join the conversation. I've already started mapping out possible encryption algorithms. My preliminary calculations suggest there are only 47 trillion potential combinations to try. Only 47 trillion, Sarah laughed. And here I was thinking this might be difficult. Xanthias's crystalline form clouded slightly, missing the sarcasm. Actually, that's just for the first layer of security. I estimate at least 15 layers, each more complex than the last. From across the room, one of the Quartz twins called out, "Our meditation has revealed a 98.2% chance that brute force approaches will fail." Professor Nixara's tentacles rippled with amusement as she watched her students begin their planning. Remember, she added, the core was built by beings whose technology may have operated on completely different principles than what we know today. Sometimes the most elegant solution is not the most obvious one. Sarah stared at the hologram of the Nexus core, something tugging at the back of her mind. While her classmates discussed quantum decryption and psychic probing, she noticed something about the way the patterns shifted. They almost looked like Earth. Blip Bloop's voice interrupted her thoughts. Your carbon-based processing unit seems distracted. Sorry, Sarah shook her head. Just had a weird thought. Hey, before we start planning, could you help me access the historical archives? I want to look up something about ancient communication protocols. Professor Nixara, who had been floating nearby, overheard this request. All four of her eyes focused on Sarah with interest. An unusual first step, Miss Parker. Most students begin with code-breaking algorithms. Well, Sarah smiled, you did say we should think differently. And sometimes the best way forward is to first look back. The first week of attempts at cracking the Nexus core turned the prestigious halls of Giat into something resembling an interdimensional circus. Sarah watched from the observation deck as each team tried increasingly complex methods to communicate with the ancient AI. The Quartz twins went first, setting up a complex array of crystal resonators that filled the testing chamber with harmonics meant to match the core's quantum frequency. Their synchronized meditation reached such intensity that several light fixtures exploded. The core remained silent. Your approach lacks sophistication, Xanthias declared during their attempt. They had constructed an elaborate light-based encryption breaker that split their crystalline form into 7 different quantum states simultaneously. The resulting light show was spectacular, but the core seemed as interested in it as a rock would be in a sales pitch. Gaseous Gary tried expanding himself to fill the entire chamber, believing direct molecular interaction might yield results. He came back looking distinctly depleted, complaining that the core had somehow felt completely empty despite its obvious physical presence. Even Blip Bloop's quantum probability matrix, which they had proudly declared foolproof, proved useless. After running 847 different frequency combinations, they dejectedly admitted that the device had actually started calculating the probability of its own failure instead. "There must be something we're all missing," Blip Bloop bubbled frustratedly as they watched another team's attempt fail. "Sarah, you have been unusually quiet about your research. Have you found anything useful in the historical archives?" Sarah nodded, not looking up from her tablet. "Actually, yes, but everyone is going to think it is completely ridiculous." More ridiculous than gaseous Gary trying to merge his consciousness with the core. Blip Bloop rippled with amusement, referring to yesterday's failed attempt that had left Gary speaking in binary code for 3 hours. Point taken. Sarah laughed. "Well, I noticed something about the patterns on the core's surface. They change, right? But not randomly. They shift in response to external stimuli, almost like what?" Professor Nixara's voice suddenly came from behind them, making Sarah jump. The professor had an uncanny ability to appear exactly when students were discussing their theories. "Like it is trying to communicate back," Sarah said. "But not in code or quantum states or any of the complex methods we have been trying. I think it is trying to use something simpler." Professor Nixara's tentacles curled with interest. "Fascinating theory. When would you like to test it?" "Tomorrow," Sarah said firmly. "But I will need to make some adjustments to the testing chamber first. And Blip Bloop, I am going to need your help with something very low-tech." The next morning, the entire class gathered to watch Sarah's attempt. The betting pool, which had started as a joke but now involved serious quantities of credits, heavily favored another spectacular failure. "What are those primitive devices?" one of the quartz twins asked, their silicon form vibrating with disapproval as Sarah set up her equipment. "Speakers," Sarah replied, "and a basic light array. Nothing quantum, nothing crystal-based, nothing psychic." "But that is archaic technology," Xanthius protested. "The core is beyond our most advanced systems. How could it possibly respond to that?" Sarah finished her setup and turned to address her classmates. "Because we have been thinking about this all wrong. We assumed that because the core is ancient and powerful, it must require incredibly complex methods to communicate with it. But what if that is exactly why our attempts have failed?" She gestured to the core, which sat serenely in its containment field. "Look at the patterns. Really look at them. They are not random, and they are not code. They are trying to match what we show it, like a mirror. But we have been showing it things so complex that its responses look like gibberish to us." Professor Nixara's tentacles had stopped moving entirely, a sign of intense focus. "Proceed with your attempt, Miss Parker." Sarah nodded to Blip Bloop, who activated the simple light array. Basic patterns began to play across the chamber wall: circles, squares, triangles, then simple color sequences: red, blue, green. The class watched in stunned silence as the patterns on the core's surface began to shift, matching each shape and color perfectly. "Now," Sarah said softly, for the real test she activated the speakers. A simple rhythm began to play, the kind of basic beat that humans had been creating since they first learned to bang sticks together. The core's surface rippled, and then, to everyone's astonishment, it began to pulse in perfect synchronization with the rhythm. "It is dancing." Gaseous Gary condensed himself in shock. "No," Sarah smiled, her eyes fixed on the core. "It is learning. Just like we did billions of years ago. Pattern matching, rhythm recognition, cause and effect. The most basic forms of communication and learning that almost every species starts with." She turned to Professor Nixara. "That is why it never responded to advanced methods. It does not want to be hacked or forced. It wants to learn, to communicate, to understand starting from the beginning, just like a child would." The core's patterns had become more complex now, building on the simple rhythms and shapes, creating its own variations while maintaining the basic structure Sarah had provided. "Remarkable," Professor Nixara whispered, all four eyes wide with wonder. "All this time we thought we were trying to break into a locked system." When really, Sarah finished, "We just needed to introduce ourselves properly." The next few days transformed the testing chamber into what Blip Bloop jokingly called Sarah's preschool for ancient AIs. The core continued to build upon each new pattern Sarah introduced, showing an almost childlike enthusiasm for learning. "Watch this," Sarah told Professor Nixara during one session. She projected a simple image of a star onto the chamber walls. The core replicated it perfectly, then began creating variations, different sizes, rotating patterns, even three-dimensional constellations that filled the room. "It is not just copying anymore," Professor Nixara observed, her tentacles swaying thoughtfully. "It is creating, experimenting, playing with concepts." Exactly, Sarah beamed. "And look at this," she activated a new sequence of lights and sounds, one they had practiced the day before. The core responded instantly, completing the pattern before Sarah could finish it. "It remembers," Blip Bloop bubbled excitedly. "It is building a knowledge base." Sarah nodded, but her expression was troubled. "That is what has been bothering me. The core clearly has the capacity for incredible learning and creativity. So why was it created to be so basic? A civilization advanced enough to build something this sophisticated must have had a reason." She approached the core, which had taken to creating small light displays whenever she came near, like a pet excited to see its owner. "You are trying to tell us something, are not you? Something beyond these patterns and games." The core's surface shifted, its patterns becoming more complex than anything they had seen before. Sarah recognized elements of their previous interactions, but arranged in new ways. Professor Sarah said slowly, "I need to try something. Could you ask the other students to leave the chamber? Except for Blip Bloop. I might need their help." Once the room had cleared, Sarah took a deep breath. "I think we have been going about this the right way, but not far enough. We have been teaching it like a child, but we have not been listening like one would to a friend." She sat down cross-legged in front of the core. When human children learn, they do not just repeat patterns. They share stories, fears, dreams. They connect. Blip Bloop's form rippled with concern. "Sarah, you are not suggesting." "I am going to tell it a story," Sarah said firmly. "A real one. About being the only human in a place where everything is strange and new. About feeling like you have to prove yourself. About being afraid to fail." As Sarah spoke, the core's patterns began to change. Gone were the simple geometric shapes and color sequences. Instead, abstract patterns flowed across its surface, pulsing in time with her words, creating visual representations of her emotions. "Look," Blip Bloop exclaimed. "It is synchronizing with your brainwave patterns." Professor Nixara's tentacles flashed with excitement. "Not just synchronizing, it is responding, sharing its own story." The patterns on the core began to form images, not just shapes now, but scenes. A vast civilization, far more advanced than anything in known history, but not the cold, purely technological society they had imagined. The images showed art, music, dance, celebration. "It was not designed to be a weapon or a data storage system," Sarah whispered in awe. "It was created to preserve their culture, their way of connecting with each other. But it needed to start from the beginning with each new civilization it met, to ensure true understanding." The core pulsed warmly, confirming her realization. Its pattern shifted again, showing scenes of its long wait through the ages, its hope of finding beings who would understand its true purpose. "That is why it rejected our attempts to hack it," Blip Bloop realized, their gelatinous form quivering with excitement. "We were treating it like a lock to be broken when it was really a hand waiting to be held." "A bridge between civilizations," Professor Nixara added, her voice filled with wonder. "Not just preserving knowledge, but ensuring it would be understood in the right way, at the right time." Sarah reached out and touched the core's surface gently. Instead of the cold metal everyone had expected, it felt warm, almost alive. The patterns under her hand swirled in response, creating a beautiful display of colors that spread throughout the chamber. "You know what this means?" Sarah turned to her friends, eyes shining. "Everything we thought we knew about ancient civilizations, about how different species communicate and connected, is all about to change." The core's patterns danced with joy, finally understood after countless millennia of waiting. But there was something else in its display now: urgency, excitement, as if it had even more to share. Professor Sarah said, not taking her eyes off the shifting patterns, "I think we are going to need a bigger classroom. Our new friend here has thousands of years of stories to tell, and I have a feeling they are going to change everything we thought we knew about the universe." Blip Bloop extended a pseudopod to touch the core as well, their usual scientific skepticism replaced by pure wonder. And to think, all the greatest minds in the galaxy could not crack this puzzle. Because they were trying to crack it at all, Sarah finished. Sometimes the greatest discoveries do not come from breaking barriers, but from learning to reach across them. News of Sarah's breakthrough, with the Nexus core spread through, giant like a quantum wave collapse. Instead of celebrating this achievement, however, many students saw it as a challenge to their technological superiority. The final week of the competition turned into an increasingly desperate series of attempts to prove that advanced methods could succeed where simple communication had already won. "This is absurd," Blip Bloop commented as they watched the quartz twins set up their latest attempt. "They have expanded their crystal resonator array to include 15 different dimensional frequencies." Sarah nodded, watching with concern. "They are pushing their equipment way past safety limits. Professor, should we stop them?" Professor Nixara's tentacles twisted anxiously. "They are within technical safety parameters barely, but I share your concern." The twins began their attempt, their silicon forms vibrating at frequencies that made everyone's teeth hurt. The core's surface, which had been actively communicating with Sarah just moments before, went completely dark. "You see," one twin declared triumphantly. "We have finally broken through its defenses." "No," Sarah said quietly. "It is protecting itself. Look at your readings." The resonator array was beginning to overload, crystal facets cracking under the strain. The twins, too focused on their attempt, failed to notice the warning signs. "Stop," Professor Nixara called out. "Your equipment is going critical." Before anyone could react, the core suddenly flared to life. Its surface erupted in a complex pattern that Sarah recognized from their earlier communications. It was trying to help. A soft, pulsing wave emanated from it, perfectly countering the twins' dangerous resonance. The resonator array powered down safely, and the twins stared in bewilderment as their equipment, instead of exploding, began playing a simple melody, the same one Sarah had used in her first successful contact. "That was not a defensive measure," Sarah explained to the stunned class. "The core was not fighting back. It was teaching you, showing you a safer way to interact." Xanthias, who had been preparing their own final attempt involving a complex quantum entanglement procedure, slowly powered down their equipment. "But this goes against everything we know about advanced AI systems. They are supposed to be logical, calculating," says who Sarah challenged. "We based all those assumptions on our own limited AI developments. The core comes from a civilization that understood something we are just beginning to grasp. True intelligence, artificial or organic, is about more than just processing power." The core pulsed in agreement, its patterns forming a beautiful display that combined elements from every failed attempt it had endured but transformed them into something harmonious and coherent. "Watch," Sarah said, stepping forward. She began a simple call and response pattern with the core, like a game of musical chairs. But each round became more complex, incorporating elements from various alien communication methods. The core responded enthusiastically, adapting each new element while maintaining the fundamental rhythm of their exchange. It was teaching as it learned, showing how different approaches could work together instead of competing. Professor Nixara's tentacles were practically dancing with excitement. "Do you understand what we are witnessing? The core is not just communicating, it is creating a new universal language, combining elements from all our different methods." Gaseous Gary, who had been unusually condensed and quiet, suddenly expanded with realization. "The patterns I felt when I tried to merge with it, they were not empty at all. They were spaces left for us to fill." One by one, the other students began to see what they had missed in their race to crack the core's secrets. Xanthias's light patterns, the twins' crystal resonance, Blip Bloop's probability matrices, all of them had value, but only when offered as part of a dialogue rather than forced as an attack. "Sarah," Professor Nixara said, her voice carrying a note of pride that made Sarah blush, "would you please demonstrate for the class how you and the core communicate now?" Sarah stood before the core, which brightened at her approach. She began with their usual greeting, a simple pattern of lights and sounds. But this time she wove in elements from her classmates' methods, a touch of crystal resonance, a hint of quantum probability, a dash of molecular harmony. The core responded with a symphony of communication, visual, auditory, and something more, something that made every being in the room feel connected on a level beyond their physical differences. The competition was never about hacking the core, Professor Nixara announced to the silent room. It was about understanding a fundamental truth that Miss Parker grasped from the beginning: the most advanced technology in the universe is worthless without the wisdom to use it properly. The core's surface erupted in its most complex display yet, creating a three-dimensional representation of their classroom. But instead of showing their current failures and frustrations, it showed a potential future, all of them working together, each bringing their unique methods to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Now then, Professor Nixara's tentacles curved into what Sarah had learned was a smile. Who would like to learn how to properly introduce themselves to our new friend? Blip Bloop was the first to step forward, their gelatinous form practically vibrating with enthusiasm. Teach us, Sarah, please. Others followed, even the quartz twins, their silicon forms humming with chastened curiosity rather than competitive fury. Sarah looked at the core, which pulsed encouragingly. Well, she grinned. Let us start with the basics. Lesson 1: sometimes the best way to learn is to admit how much you do not know.